Tonight we're honoring our Values in Action Committee. But we could ask the question, which values and what actions? A lot of religions focus on telling you what to believe. But some religions answer a different question. What should I do? How should I do it? When should I do it? There are religions with commandments, with rules that tell you how to behave. This week in the cycle of Torah readings, we transitioned from legends to laws. This current Torah portion is called Mishpatim, or judgments. Last week, the 10 commandments were given. But there are many more laws that follow this week about slavery, laws of damages, what in legal schools we call torts, laws of lending and the appropriate circumstances for lending, and forgiveness of debts, even laws prohibiting idolatry and the worship of statues. In fact, most of the Torah after Exodus chapter 20, which was ended last week, most of the rest of the Torah through the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, most of its laws, legal materials, telling you what to do or what not to do. Or occasionally you have a very thin story with a legal punchline. Like 4 daughters come to Moses and they say, our father died and what happens to our inheritance? So Moses goes to God and God tells him, here's what you do for it's just a frame. It's the law of inheritance. So there's a little narrative, okay, but most of it is about the laws. And the basic unit of law, the basic measurement for personal behavior in historical Jewish religion was the commandment. The Hebrew word is mitzvah. The plural is mitzvot. For example, if you think of the traditional Shabbat candle blessing, where you praise God, King of the universe, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctified us with his mitzvot, with his commandments, v'tzivanu, and commanded us, lehadlik, to light the candles of Hanukkah, the candles of Shabbat, etc. Now you might think that there are only 10 commandments, right? We think of the 10 commandments. But in traditional rabbinic thought, there were 613 commandments. 365 negative commandments, that means thou shalt not commit murder, adultery, etc. And if there are 365 negative, that meant there were 248 positive commandments. Honor your mother and father, right? Offer a sacrifice at a certain time. Now, it's impossible for any one person to perform all 613 commandments, because you would have to be both a man and a woman. You would have to be both a farmer and a city dweller. You would have to be both a priest and a king, and you weren't allowed to be both because they're from different tribes. So there's no way you could do all the commandments. But the concept was that there are lots and lots and lots of commandments to do. It has a psychological function because bad things happen. And this way you have an explanation. I must have messed up on number 432. Or maybe I forgot 437. There's always a reason. There's always something you could have missed, so maybe having more commandments so that you have a reason for failure and thus a reason for suffering has a function. Now, if you actually look at a list of those 613 commandments, you'll find that some of them are ethical, no stealing, pay your worker their wages on time. Some of them are what we might call ritual commandments, forbidding certain animals to be eaten, or prescribing certain sacrifices for certain festivals. Some of the laws we might call quirky. You're not allowed to have linen and wool in the same garment. It says, do not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, in case you were tempted. This becomes, in rabbinic thought, the basis for the separation of milk and meat, which requires different dishes and different waiting times after eating one or the other, and there's a whole mountain of laws built on that little one verse. And there's even some additional commandments in addition to the 613 that the rabbis created. For example, reading the Purim Megillah, or lighting Hanukkah candles, which makes sense. If the Torah was given at Mount Sinai to Moses, Purim and Hanukkah are way after Moses. So there's no way Moses would have had commandments about doing things for those holidays. Or even something we did tonight. Lighting Shabbat candles is not prescribed anywhere in the Torah. It's a rabbinic commandment, even though you still say, thank you, God, for commanding me to light the lights of Shabbat. One rabbi actually asked in the Talmud, where did he command us if it's not in the Torah? And the rabbi said, well, there's a passage that says, appoint judges and they will tell you what to do. In other words, we, the rabbis, have the transitive power of commandment. And so if we tell you God said so, God said so. In fact, the lighting of Shabbat candles might have been the resolution of a debate over whether you were allowed to have fire lit on Shabbat at all. Some groups put out all their fires and only did Shabbat in the dark. But the dominant strain said, not only can you have them lit, but lighting a candle that you let burn out all the way to the end, that's the beginning of Shabbat in your home. Now, the traditional approach to these actions was that you were supposed to do them no matter what you thought. There's a famous story that God shopped the Torah to lots of other people. He went to the Canaanites and said, would you accept this Torah of laws? And they said, well, tell us what's in it and then we'll decide. Nope. He shopped it to the Parthians, to other people, to the Persians, to the Babylonians, all through time and space. All of them wanted to know what was in it. And when he came to the Hebrew people, they said, quoting a line from Exodus, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. We'll do whatever you say, now tell us what to do. That's how they interpret that verse. The concept was, we accept the commandments, whatever they are, even if they're quirky. Now, you can still look for reasons behind these commandments or come up with justifications after the fact. You might find new ways to apply them, but from traditional Jewish thought, they were not optional. You couldn't decide, I like 435, but not 542. Think about the case of the agri-processor's kosher meat plant in Iowa, in Postville, Iowa. You may remember this was a kosher meat plant. People from New York had moved there to create kosher beef that they could send back to New York and other places, but they treated their workers terribly. It wasn't about how the workers were treated, though. You see, the rules of kashrut, the rules of the kosher slaughter were that it was slaughtered correctly. And how the workers were treated was not seen as germane to whether the animals were slaughtered in a kosher way. Some people tried to create a kind of ethical kosher certification after that happened, but the most Orthodox won't accept it because it doesn't matter. The worker's context is not as important as the way the animal is slaughtered. I personally think kosher for Passover chocolate cake mix should be banned. The point is the deprivation, right? Not jumping through the hoops to not have a certain amount of wheat with a certain amount of yeast. But for some people, it's the letter of the law. That's what counts, not what we might think of as the spirit of the law. If the law says none of this, but that's allowed, then you're fine. Now, in modern times, Jewish freedom meant choosing which Jewish practices you wanted to follow. In other words, choosing which mitzvot you wanted to do. The choice itself was the sign of modernity and freedom. If you had new ideas about Jewish life, new ideas about how you wanted to live or what you actually believed, that meant you might change what you were going to do. Your values changed your actions. Maybe you didn't accept some of the limits of diet or dress. Maybe you were willing to travel further on Shabbat. Maybe you would recite some prayers or blessings, but not others. Even the word mitzvah took on a new meaning. It got the sense now of to do a good deed. If you do a mitzvah, you're doing a good deed. They might focus on the ethical laws, or they might simply think being kind to someone. It's a mitzvah, lowercase m, instead of, or mem, I guess, in Hebrew, and not a capital mem, even though there's no capital letters in Hebrew. Sometimes our values and practices today are a clear evolution from traditional Jewish practice. There's an old Jewish tradition of giving tzedakah, of giving to charity. Tzedakah itself means righteousness, doing the right thing. And the idea of contributing to charity and doing so in a way that respects the dignity of the person receiving the money, that's a very deeply rooted Jewish tradition. And we still do that in liberal, secular Jewish circles. At other times, we have new ideas from outside of Jewish life that have been brought into Jewish life with a Jewish hook. Think about modern environmentalism. If modern environmentalism had always been part of Jewish commandments, then in the 12th century, Jews would have been recycling. But they didn't. What they did instead was they learned from the outside world that emphasized these new models of environmental activism, and then they found ways to connect it to historical Jewish values. There's a value called do not waste. That might work. There's a value that wants you to minimize the pain of animals, to not be wantonly cruel to animals. Maybe that applies to a vegetarian lifestyle. And that famous phrase, tikkun olam, repairing the world, originally was a mystical concentration to restore divine sparks to a Godhead beyond the universe. Now it's clean up, put away, help people. It's doing community service, it's doing environmental action. It's a new meaning, hooked on to Jewish life. Jewish beliefs have changed a lot in the last 200 years, and it makes sense that Jewish actions would have changed also. There's a famous story set in the 2nd century of the Common Era, where Rabbi Tarfon and his elders were reclining in an attic, and they debated which is more important, study or action. Rabbi Tarfon said, action is more important. Rabbi Akiva said, study is more important. And the elders all agreed with Rabbi Akiva that study is more important because study leads to action. Values in action. Our ideas influence what we do. We are humanistic Jews. As Jews, we are heirs to Jewish culture, tradition, practice, and values. As humanists, we make up our own minds what we believe about the world, our ethics, and how we live. And those beliefs about our freedom and autonomy are very different from the rabbinic world that created those lists of hundreds of mitzvot, of commandments, and sub-mitzvot and sub-sub-mitzvot. If we are free to believe what we want, and we live by those beliefs, our study will lead to different actions or inactions. And this is why we call our community service work values in action. So I want to give you a few examples of our values in action. Caring for those in need. There are certainly Torah commandments to care for the stranger, to care for the widow and the orphan. But we are also motivated by our humanist understandings of our interdependency living in community, the positive value of compassion and empathy for human suffering of any group, anywhere. We understand the importance psychologically, practically, of providing for basic human needs like food and clothing and shelter. Because once you have those needs met, then you have enabled the freedom of choice and flourishing. If you can't eat, how can you make your values live in your own way? We want to empower other people to live the freedom that we have. We can only do so if they have the basic sustenance they need to live their life. Second example, caring for the sick. A very traditional Jewish practice to visit the sick, to care for the dead. But it's also an example of mutual support within a community. As we said in our service, no humanist is an island. We might have that need someday, after all. We might need someone to help us to the grocery store or to help make arrangements for us, a drive to a doctor's appointment. We might want compassion and concern. So there is a reciprocity to it. There's a practical side to it. But it's also an example of generosity and caring for others. Our Helping Hands group, working within Values in Action, helps drive people to doctors, writes get well cards or condolence cards. And I provide pastoral visits to people in hospitals and rehab facilities to try to give them a broader perspective, to help uplift them if possible, and even in the case of a terminal illness, to give them a sense of dignity and power even in those last days to do what they choose and to live out their values as long as they can. A third value is human dignity. We are able to be in charge of our own life, and we want to empower others to do the same. Many of our collections are not for basic needs of food and clothing. They might be toiletries, so you have a sense of personal dignity. Self-care products that let you feel like you're a real person, that you value, that you're valued, and that you matter. Traditionally, there was a custom called pe'ah. When you harvested a field with your oxen and you turn the corner, don't go back and go over the corner you left. If it's a square field and you make the curve, leave that corner for the widow and the orphan. If you're harvesting wheat and you're chopping down the stalks and some of the grains fall to the ground, leave that for other people to go back and glean and pick up what happened to fall. And you do the main harvest and they get what's left over for you. There's always more that you don't need that you can hand off to others. One of our mitzvah students did a wonderful project. She was part of a larger organization called the Glass Slipper Project. And the idea behind this was to find people who had outgrown their 8th grade prom dresses, who would then donate them for people who couldn't afford to buy brand new prom dresses to have a nice prom dress and go to the prom like everybody else. It was like a gleaning. You were gleaning the prom dresses that weren't needed anymore, just like any donation of clothing. It's stuff we no longer need, but someone else can use, and we make it possible for them to do that. That's that care for others that gives them the dignity of having clothing, of having a sense of self, or even looking beautiful on an 8th grade prom. A fourth value we have is human agency. People can make a difference. If you just pray, that's sending hopes out into the ether, and who knows what happens next. But if we act, if we do something, we know it makes a difference. Many years ago, we initiated a concept of a day of action as a counter-program to the National Day of Prayer. Now, the American Humanist Association some years before had started what they called the National Day of Reason, because their approach was prayer is irrational, so the opposite of prayer is reason, so we'll make a National Day of Reason. I thought, actually, the humanist parallel to prayer is doing something. If we don't pray, we do something. So why not have a day of action instead? Together, when we're working as a group, we can do even more and make even more of a difference. So that's why Kol Hadash presents opportunities to volunteer throughout the year. We do a joint mitzvah day with the North Shore Unitarian Church that's connected to International Good Deeds Days. These are all expressions of the power people have to do good. And finally, we have a value that produces opportunities instead of obligations. Remember mitzvot, commandments, this is what you have to do. Our philosophy of community service is giving people the chance to do good. No requirements, no forced volunteering. No one is ever voluntold here what they have to do. No major guilt tripping. Perhaps we're betraying our Jewish heritage by not guilt tripping, but we don't do that. Our mitzvahs are not obligations that you're forced to do. They're not orders by cosmic command. Our mitzvahs are good deeds that we choose to do. Kol Hadash values in action creates opportunities to choose to do good for yourself. In the end, the most important idea is an answer to a very basic question. Why should you be good to other people? It could be because an authority said so. God, tradition, the Torah, maybe your rabbi, not this rabbi. Maybe you're good because it's good for you. It's good to have the reputation of being a good person that helps you in society. Maybe it makes you feel better to help other people. Or maybe you do good because you want to reduce human suffering. You want to increase human flourishing and empowerment. You want to connect with your neighbors, your congregation, your community. The Hebrew Bible has a wonderful phrase for this. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now, love your neighbor as yourself might mean treat them as you would want to be treated, or don't do to them what you would not have done to you. But maybe it also means love your neighbor, they are like you. Not just love your neighbor like you, but love your neighbor because they are like you. Human dignity, human equality, it's a Jewish value, a humanist value, and for us, it's a value that leads to action.